Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk about a book that faces very boldly, I think, one of the major problems of our time, homelessness. The book is called Silent Voices, and the subtitle is People with Mental Disorders on the Street. The author, Dr. Robert Okin, is with us, and his book is published by Golden Pine Press. Thank you for coming aboard.
Thank you.
You definitely have the credentials to do this book. They're rather staggering. You've served as chief of psychiatry at the San Francisco General Hospital and professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. For 17 years, you've been involved in that work, and you're also a former state commissioner of mental health for both Vermont and Massachusetts. Did they throw you out of those states and so you moved west? Is that what happened?
No, not quite.
Okay. And throughout your career, you've developed crucial services and clinical case management programs to enable mentally ill people to live with dignity in the community. And that notion of living in the community, I think, is central to your thinking.
Yes.
And you're also a member of the Board of Advisors of Disabilities Rights International, known as DRI. So you really got the stuff to write a book on this very, very important subject. What I'm curious about is what is the size of the problem? How many mentally ill are living on the streets?
Well, in the United States, there are approximately 250,000 people.
What?
250,000 mentally ill people on the streets.
On the streets.
And about another 200 or 250,000 mentally ill people living in jails and prisons.
Wow. Soon to be on the streets when they're released, I guess,
yes.
In many cases.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Now, your interest in these people is not just clinical.
No. In fact, the idea for this project really started when one night, on a rainy, cold night, when I was hurrying to my car, and I saw a homeless woman lying on the street. And I just couldn't imagine how she could stand it, not just for the next hour, but the whole night and the day and night after that, and days and nights after that. And I felt so badly for her. I just couldn't imagine how she could make it. So I wanted to know how people like her managed to survive against such a grim backdrop. So I spent the next 2 years on the streets talking to and photographing people who were mentally ill and homeless.
I think that's a very courageous thing to do in the first place. I mean, I can't count how many people on the street I've passed and done nothing. I know I've been involved over the years with the St. Vincent de Paul Society. Yeah. And I used to preach to them that at least look at them, because it seems that we have this idea that a person on the street somehow, and I always asked when did it happen, but sometime, a person on the street lost their humanity. Yeah. And they were less than human. And so, I mean, to take this on, I think, is an act of courage. And not only did you stop to talk and listen, you also took pictures. And they are very, very interesting and very moving.
Yeah, well, I wanted to capture the faces of these people because I always found them beautiful. And I would come home at the end of a night, and I would look at the photographs and just stare at them and try to imagine what people were thinking. I decided not to stage the photographs. What I did was I asked people to tell me about their lives, And in the midst of that, I would just take the photographs. So the result was that a lot of the photographs, as you could see, show a lot of feeling on people's faces.
Yes.
Because they're talking about their lives.
Yes, and you can read history in their faces.
Yes.
And you can read history in the shape of their bodies or the condition of their bodies.
Yeah.
Quite amazing.
Yeah.
Quite amazing. The thing that happened with you in doing this, we say this often, that if you help the homeless or help the helpless, that you'll get more out of it than they will. And what you tried to do is to get what you call an appreciation of what most of them had been up against from the day they were born.
Yeah.
And stuff that they were still dealing with day after day. So even when you saw how they were actively contributing to their unhappy lives, something that used to infuriate me, you write, and infuriates all of us, I began to understand why they were doing it. I could see that their bad choices were driven by forces that felt irresistible to them. So you began discovery, and a lot happened to you as you began the project.
By the way, I think that what you just said is really a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. I often found that, when I was talking to people, that I would think that if I had been dealt the hand they had been dealt,
mm-hmm.
I honestly don't think I could have done any better than they.
Well, Silent Voices, your book, was done with a clear purpose in mind. When we get back here, we'll look at what that purpose might have been.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Silent Voices, people with mental disorders on the street. And boy, it could read on the streets of San Francisco, couldn't it? The author, Dr. Robert Okin, has joined us. His book is published by Golden Gate Press. And as I read it, I kept thinking the ways that this book is different from other books. And one is that it speaks of a conclusion up front in the introduction, where you write, "My conclusion from the work I've done in the hospital and on the street," now you've been on this problem for a long time, "has always confirmed my conviction that most people, no matter how dramatic their presentation, can be helped, and that the gap between what we know can help these people and what we are actually doing as a society to help is enormous. The hopelessness with which we approach this problem has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the basic question, how could you help somebody if you don't talk to them? And try to have some kind of relationship. Perhaps this cycle would be less tenacious, you write, if it were not reinforced by another that involves our tendency to avoid any meaningful contact with these people. Our avoidance, the way we remain deaf to their stories and blind to their faces, has the effect of nailing in and reinforcing our conviction that they are fundamentally different from us. So you've written the book now to destroy that conclusion, to alter that feeling of helplessness, that it's all done. I think that's what you're trying to do, isn't it?
Yes.
And you do a good job. You do a good job.
Thank you.
You also have talked about ways in which you were surprised as you worked on the book.
Yes. I expected people to be, kind of encrusted and defensive and resentful and not to want to have anything to do with me.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I was incredibly anxious when I first started out this project because I was sure they would just tell me to go away.
Were you scared when you started?
I wasn't scared of them. I was scared that they would just want to have nothing to do with me.
I see. Okay.
Because it was like our roles had been transposed. Now I was the one with the tin cup. I was asking them for something, and they could either say, get lost, buddy, or agree to give me something. So our roles were completely transformed, and I didn't have the trappings of authority that I do in the hospital. I was just a guy on the street.
With a camera.
With a camera.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was surprised about was that they didn't react to me that way. They were gentle and accepting and were willing to talk to me, and often willing to talk to me with tremendous feeling. It's not like they were pretending or putting on a facade or, they were really talking from their hearts. And I often thought, God, if I were in their position, how would I react to some stranger coming up to me and asking me to divulge really some of the most intimate aspects of their lives?
One of the things that they were willing to share with you, you've written, is their grief.
Yes.
And that's most unusual,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I think I was most surprised at that. I would say almost 50% of the people I spoke to became tearful at some point during the interview.
Wow.
It just shows you how much sadness they're dealing with.
Yes. Let's in a sense meet some of your friends on the street. There was a woman named Heidi.
Heidi, yes.
Heidi, whose two daughters, were blown to bits by suicide bombers in Iraq.
Yes.
Ugh. And how did you find her?
I was walking near the ferry building, and she was there with a cart. And I went over to her, and I asked if I could talk to her. And she said yes. So we went to a coffee shop, and she told me about her life, which was tragic from beginning to the current time.
Yeah. There was another fellow that you met, whom in the book you call the shoe salesman, and I put a note next to him, the most positive guy in the book.
Yes.
He had a goal of selling a pair of shoes in his possession for $10,000.
Yes.
And you know what you see on the society pages of this day, he may make that one of these days.
Yeah, he was a man who was full of optimism. He had a great sense of humor, and he managed to maintain that despite the grim conditions on the street. But his humor was infectious, and I remember after I left him, I felt upbeat.
Oh, how marvelous.
Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't buy the shoes, did you?
No, I didn't. But he wanted to polish my shoes, and he did the most diligent job. I was there for 15 minutes, and he got every nook and cranny of my shoe.
Oh, for crying out loud. That's great.
Yeah.
Men and women with silent voices will continue to speak to us when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Dr. Robert Okin is with us today to talk about his book called Silent Voices, People with Mental Disorders on the Street. Publisher, Golden Pine Press. One of the things we like to do on this program is have the author at some point read from the book. And you and I have discussed this. I'm very clever about it. And this comes from near the end of the book, and it begins with, "If we could hear." Please read it.
If we could hear beyond the silence and see beyond the symptoms of the homeless mentally ill, we might be able to perceive the ways we are the same, not just the ways we are different. We'd be able to see that we all get colds when the temperature drops, wet and uncomfortable when it rains on us, and exhausted when we haven't slept. We'd be able to see that we all get hungry for food, affection, esteem, money, something. We'd have to acknowledge that we all have feelings, needs, and vulnerabilities, that we're all trying to make sense of our worlds, and that we all screw up and do things that make bad situations worse, take the wrong path, or fall off the horse and have trouble getting back on. And if we understood all this, we might feel more connected to the people we now shun. We might identify with their predicaments. We might offer them more understanding and less blame. We might choose to include them in rather than exclude them from the spheres of life that are open to the rest of us. We might be more willing to share with them than withhold from them and feel less resentful doing so. And if our willingness to share extended to the political realm, we might make different decisions as a society. We might be more willing to enact legislation that would provide mentally ill people with decent housing, clothes, food, dental care, and mental health treatment. This, in turn, would make it easier for us to see what we have in common with them. Seeing them as fully human, we might also be less likely to segregate and punish them. We might conclude that they are entitled to a life of dignity simply because they are human.
Amen. Amen. One of the beauties of the book, I think, is that in addition to grasping the plight of those who are mentally ill and homeless on our streets in a psychological, emotional way, you also come down hard on the politics of it, and you have some very, very clear suggestions. And the first thing that you talk about in that area of the book is the notion of case management. What's that, and what does it do?
Well, case managers are clinicians, usually social workers, who I would say almost stand in for parents. They have a very small caseload. They devote themselves to maybe 10 clients, and they have the time to help the client do whatever the client needs. There is almost no such thing as saying no if you're a case manager. You don't say, no, it's not my job. You help the person shop. You help the person do their laundry, take care of their room. You try to convince the person to go on medication if that's necessary. And you act as an advocate for the person in getting through the complicated bureaucracies that people have to get through in order to get housing and food stamps and SSI and other kinds of services. Very hard for these people to get those things themselves, which is one of the reasons that people remain on the streets, that they just can't get through the labyrinth.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that they can't even get started, you bring up in the book in several places, and that is that they have nobody to watch their stuff.
Yeah.
And that's crazy.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely true. They've got a shopping cart or some other thing with wheels, and if they leave it any place, it gets ripped off.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the stories that I tell in the book was of Heidi, who was supposed to go to an appointment, a prenatal appointment at the hospital.
Right.
And we needed to take the bus, and we couldn't find anything to do with her cart. She couldn't leave it. She couldn't. There were no people around that she trusted that she could have, look over the cart. And with all my connections in San Francisco, and with all my sophistication and blah blah blah, I could not figure out a way of getting her to the hospital and having her cart stay safe. It's a completely immobilizing kind of way of living.
Yeah, and it's an amazing scenario, one that people or ordinary people would never think of. It's something you'd never think of unless you lived on the streets.
Yeah. Nor did I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but nor did I think of it when I was sitting in my office at the hospital, and I wondered why someone didn't show up.
Yes.
It just didn't occur to me. Well, maybe they had no one to look at their cart for them.
My goodness.
If I could say one more thing back to case management that's really crucial.
Absolutely. We got a minute left. Say
okay. One of the most important things that case managers do is help people find housing and get subsidized housing. And I would say if there were two magic bullets to help this problem, one of them would be case management and the other would be housing. And this is not a super complicated problem to solve. It's not astrophysics. Homeless people need a home, and mentally ill and homeless people need someone to help them get a home. And with a home and a case manager, we could solve most of this problem in America.
I would like to suggest we have one more silver bullet. It's called Silent Voices: People with Mental Disorders on the Street by Dr. Robert L. Okin. Get it, don't forget it. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.